Before we get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about me. I'm a speech and language pathologist, primarily a pediatric speech and language pathologist, and an augmentative and alternative communication specialist at the Spalding Outpatient Center for Children over in Lexington, right next door to the Lurie Center. I've been working at Spalding now just about 5 years, and my clinical interests include AAC for patients with neurodevelopmental and multiple disabilities and neurodiversity affirming care. Formerly, I was an AAC consultant with Easter Seals of Massachusetts and got some great experience in the schools and in adult community care. I'm also an adjunct lecturer on this topic at Emerson College and presently in the middle of my clinical doctorate at the MGH IHP, where I'm working on some research and academic interests that include expanding institutional capacity for AAC services and AAC program development. Our talking points for tonight will be to describe, and what I hope that you'll take away from tonight's discussion is describing the AAC, describing different AAC evaluation and funding sources, and how choosing a funding source and an evaluation source can change the way your team can look. I hope you'll define different AAC team member roles and responsibilities. And I help to identify strategies for effective communication, collaboration, and also problem solving within an AAC team. Before we move into some of that information, I thought we could just start by doing a broad
Do you want to hold your fort, Alex?
On what is AAC. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and refers to really all methods of communication a person uses other than speech to communicate. The two key words within this definition are augmentative, which refers to any tool that can help to enhance the effectiveness of someone's speech, and alternative, which alternative tools help to provide a substitution for speech. Most tools can either act augmentatively or alternatively or in both capacities. And there are a few different types of technology that you might have seen or are familiar with, including low, mid, and high tech. So low tech AAC systems are typically printed on paper. There are also no tech AAC systems that are using only strategies that are inherent to the body, like manual sign systems. Low-tech systems that usually printed on paper that usually need to be constructed by communication partners. If you're familiar with the picture exchange communication system, that's one type of low-tech AAC system. Mid-tech AAC systems are kind of in the middle range of the available technology. These are systems that do offer voice output, so they do speak when you interact with them, but they don't have screens. So they have batteries and usually some kind of recorded speech output, but they don't have a dynamic screen like a tablet would. So this, I have a picture of one here right in the middle. This is a Big Mac switch and it functions just as described. If you press the button, it will play whatever you've recorded onto it. And then, of course, there are the high-tech systems. These are mostly programs and apps that run on tablet-based systems. Many of them are available in the Apple App Store. You can also get these programs on dedicated devices through insurance funding or other means. And it's important the reason we're reviewing the different types of technology is because depending on what type of technology is most appropriate for your loved one or your client, might change the makeup of your team and might change the roles and responsibilities of the team members that you work with. All right, so who uses AAC? Essentially, anyone for whom speech is not sufficient to meet their daily communication needs. So anyone, this is the kind of formal definition here, is that anyone who requires adaptive assistance for speaking or writing, using their gestural, spoken, or written communication, or is temporarily or permanently, is a candidate for AAC. So evaluation is appropriate for anyone whose speech doesn't meet their current skills or needs, including social, medical, and academic. There was previously some understanding that there might be prerequisites, cognitive or linguistic or motor prerequisites to accessing AAC. We now know wonderfully that this is not the case. Though we may have some limitations in obtaining insurance funding for all profiles of AAC user, it is appropriate for any individual whose speech doesn't meet their needs to receive an AAC evaluation in some capacity, especially so that we can identify the skills they might need in order to meet some of the stringent insurance requirements that are required for funding. Okay, so there are mostly 2, sometimes 3 main ways to obtain an AAC evaluation, and the way that you choose can change the way your team looks. I'll start by talking about the outpatient clinic. Similar, if you've met us over at Spalding and Lexington, that's the kind of clinic we have. Typically, outpatient clinics will either see either pediatric or adult patients for AAC evaluations. We're a little bit of a diamond in the rough over at Spalding Lexington. We see mostly pediatric patients, but we do also see adult patients with neurodevelopmental disabilities who are often underrepresented in adult services. But just know that if you were to go to a different clinic, that may not be the case there. And in the clinics, we would typically see that evaluations are provided over 1 or multiple sessions. Over at Spalding Lexington, it's in 3 sessions. And we typically obtain AAC devices. And when I say that, I mean mostly high-tech devices through insurance. Of course, if a low-tech recommendation was the most appropriate, we would work on that, but those don't have to go through insurance funding requests for the most part. And when we do move through insurance funding, that typically involves loaned trial devices and data collection across a variety of environments in order to achieve the insurance funding. In schools, these services are for students up to age 22, and they originate from the home school district. So the AAC evaluation is typically initiated by the home school district if the student, is in a collaborative or a different type of school setting. School districts may have their own in-house AAC specialist, or they may hire an external consultant to bring in to conduct AAC evaluations. And requirements for how the evaluation will be initiated, and then from there, how the process takes place does vary by the district. Some advantages and disadvantages to the 2 settings that we just looked at. So the advantage to going through an outpatient clinic or going through insurance funding is that the patient owns their own device because it's funded by their medical insurance. And because they do that, the companies that offer these devices have to adhere to strict standards in order to qualify as medical equipment. And so there's typically pretty good warranties and repair options, and some technical support is offered too with some of these companies. But the challenge with insurance is that trial data can take a long time to collect. It can take up to a month usually to collect, and it needs to support independent use. So folks who need a longer time period in order to learn how to effectively and independently use an AAC system may not fit into that month-long waiting period. There also can be out-of-pocket contributions to the family depending on the insurance plan. Advantages to school funding are typically the requirements to obtain an AAC device are not as stringent as they can be with insurance funding, which means that timeframes may be more flexible for folks that would benefit from longer teaching times. Challenges to school funding can be that the device is owned by the school ultimately, and if you were to move, the district may collect the device back, though if that device is written into the IEP, if the device is written into the IEP, the new school district should then also provide it. But then, of course, there is always occasionally when a student graduates, the school does ask for that device back. And it can be sometimes challenging. We've found when supporting students who have some collaborative placements, it can be sometimes challenging to coordinate the getting an AAC device through the home district when the student's not placed in the home district public school. No challenge that we can't overcome, but it can sometimes be challenging. The third setting that I have here is adult community agencies. And this, I only have one short bullet point, which are that services and funding processes will vary greatly by the program. So some adults, if you're, for example, a client of DDS, the Department of Developmental Services, or they may be able to offer some AAC evaluation and equipment support. Some adults are eligible for programs through Easter Seals of Massachusetts, for example, but eligibility requirements are specific and may not apply to every individual. And so I noted here because they do exist, although they are not always accessible to everyone. Okay. The reason that forming strong AAC teams is so important is that the AAC process is really living and breathing. So this image shows the broad strokes of the AAC evaluation process. We start always by looking at an individual's patterns of participation and their communication needs in their personal environments. We then assess their opportunity barriers. These are barriers that might be present in the environment or in the community at large, and also access barriers, which are barriers related to the individual's profile of skills and what their needs might be in terms of their skill development. And we use that information to then create a plan that will address these barriers and meet the communication needs right now and in the very near future. Going through this process right now doesn't tell us whether these solutions will continue to meet the needs of the individual in 1 month or 1 year or 10 years down the line. So the last step that we implement is to evaluate how effective these solutions were. Usually we're using technology to help to solve these problems. And so we want to evaluate how the technology that we chose and the implementation strategies that we chose for that technology, how they worked to meet the needs right now and in the very near future. And then periodically, we start the process all over again. So as skills, needs, participation patterns, and new challenges arise. And this kind of living, breathing, kind of cycling process is why we need a multidisciplinary and coordinated approach with our AAC teams, so that we can get a full view of how things are going and a full breadth of input from multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and multiple disciplines of expertise to be able to best put forth solutions to some of the needs that we see. So, AAC teams. I want to note that the first and most important member of the AAC team is the user themselves. So AAC users should participate, have the opportunity to participate in all decision making about their communication strategies. That goes on in a way that is appropriate and accessible to them. And so the team is really that AAC user and a group of people that work together to plan, support, review, and reflect on how AAC is used for them. This is a long list of possible team members in different environments that we might see. And it's by no means a comprehensive list. So for example, in the school, we might see that there's an SLP or maybe an AAC specialist and an SLP involved. There can be teachers and classroom aides, other therapists, occupational and physical therapist, TVI is the teacher of the visually impaired or the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. There may be orientation and mobility specialists involved, and also school psychologists and administrators, depending on the scope of what's needed for that student. In outpatient, you would maybe find someone like me, an outpatient SLP that also acts as an AAC specialist. You might also go to a clinic where they exclusively function as AAC specialists. There are other outpatient therapists that could be involved, outpatient PT, outpatient OT, physicians, and then a range of specialty physicians, including or practitioners, including audiology and ophthalmology, physical medicine and rehab, developmental medicine, psychology, psychiatry, and neurology, and the list can go on. In the community, valuable team members, we find them in family and caregivers, in peers, in home therapists and staff, especially if the individual that we're working with is an adult that resides in a day program, or in a group home, or in another type of assisted living scenario. We'll want to have some members of their home environment on the team. And also familiar and unfamiliar communication partners. Though not all of these people might weigh in on decision-making about the AAC user, they're all a part of the team in some way. So we can see here that the list of potential voices at the table, it offers such a great and amazing kind of mosaic of expertise that is really valuable to support it for supporting the AAC user. That being said, working with a large team can be daunting, but when we can find ways to collaborate and communicate well, we can center the main goal and find the common ground, no matter what perspective or expertise that we hold. Okay. Every AAC team will have every AAC team member will have direct or indirect involvement from all of the, every team will have direct or indirect involvement from all of these roles that are listed here. And these are, so all of the individuals from the last slide could hold any of these roles on the team. For the most part, not everybody is suited for every role. For example, we wouldn't take an unfamiliar communication partner and make them the intervention specialist on our team, but that person does have a role and they have their own responsibilities that need to be ultimately defined. So some roles here have ongoing involvement with an AAC user, and some roles have more periodic involvement, and some roles have shifting involvement. So they may be very present in the beginning, and then moving to more periodic. That's usually someone like me. I'm very present in the beginning when I'm conducting an AAC evaluation and getting everyone set up with funding, and then implementation support, and then usually over time, as the rest of the team is more familiar and capable of upholding and maintaining the implementation plan, I need to have less involvement. So folks that are most likely to be present in the very beginning are the AAC finders. Those are the fourth folks down the list there. And these are folks that identify people with complex communication needs and know about AAC services and can make referrals to AAC services. Then you usually have a lot of involvement from the AAC intervention specialist. That's the person that would conduct the evaluation and generally leads and coordinates intervention efforts for folks with complex communication needs. Over time, we identify daily AAC facilitators. So these are folks in every environment who provide ongoing and daily support for the AAC user. And this is operational support, so things like charging, powering the system on and off, making sure that it gets back to whatever home it has at the end of the day. They're also usually involved in vocabulary selection and possibly programming AAC systems. And then kind of on an ongoing basis, communication partners who are listeners that interact with AAC users they'll always have ongoing involvement. And we may be able to plan who they are and we may not be able to plan. And so that's helpful for us to know as we think about how we can best support our AAC user. I have also AAC experts here. Now, it's unlikely these are folks that are teaching graduate students or providing continuing education to AAC finders, preparing AAC-related policies, executing research, or providing expert testimony in a court of law. You may not meet an AAC expert on your team directly, but the AAC expert is always involved in that likely your intervention specialists and your AAC finders are interacting with them in order to be best prepared. All right. I wanted to stress how important it is to designate AAC facilitators in every environment. This is especially important. This is important for all AAC communicators, but especially for adult communicators who we were talking about before reside in group homes or other residential settings outside of a family home. because the rotating staffing of these types of settings can make it challenging for AAC implementation to be carried forward consistently. So it is critical to have facilitators in the home environment and all of the daily environments for successful and consistent implementation of AAC across settings. So it's really important to decide who on the team is going to hold what role, and if needed, when and if these roles will shift. So I thought I would describe some scenarios for how an AAC team can be built and then shaped. And this is certainly not every combination of how these roles can come together and shift. But these are a few common scenarios that I encounter in my practice. So the first one is that the AAC finder, the person that's identifying the need for an AAC system, is the school speech pathologist or the school teacher. And that person triggers whatever referral pathway they need to trigger within the school district itself to get an AAC evaluation for that student. So then, usually at that point, the AAC intervention specialist comes in as the district AAC specialist or consultant AAC specialist to conduct the AAC evaluation and provide the recommendations to the school SLP finder that initiated the referral process. And so sometimes then that district AAC specialist or the consultant will come in and then make the recommendations and then hand the reins over in terms of directing the implementation of the system to the school speech pathologist themselves. So that's how that those intervention specialist reins can be handed in this context. In this context, the AAC daily facilitators, people that are in charge of helping to use the AAC device in the school environment, and the other environments as well, are teachers, classroom aides, and home caregivers. And so you can see there would be some need for collaboration and communication between all of these folks that are kind of the representatives in each setting, so that the approach can be coordinated. Communication partners in this scenario would be peers. They could be less familiar adults. They could be medical providers. They could be community members. They could be an Uber driver on the weekend. They could be extended family from out of state or out of the country. And so though we need less coordination and collaboration with communication partners, they're important to consider because we can put together some ideas for how to help our communicator be most effective with familiar and unfamiliar communication partners. Another scenario is the kind of classic school speech to outpatient speech transition that this is my most common scenario. So the school speech pathologist and the family or the family typically would say, I think when we might have a need for an AAC system for this communicator. And then the AAC intervention specialist role is fulfilled by the outpatient SLP. So typically what would have to happen is that the school speech pathologist and the family would then have to reach out to the patient, to the child's or the person's physician in order to get a referral out to an outpatient clinic. And so the outpatient SLPs conducts the AAC evaluation and then usually would hand the reins back over as intervention specialist to the school-based speech pathologist over time, depending on the comfort of the school speech pathologists to fulfill that role. Sometimes I've worked with SLPs at schools that aren't confident in kind of driving the intervention, and so I stay involved for much, much longer and in a different capacity than I might otherwise. Facilitators in this situation, these are the folks that are with the communicator on a day-to-day basis, consistently across environments. These are the teachers, the classroom aides, and the family members. So the outpatient SLP isn't really a strong daily AAC facilitator in this case, usually because we may only see a patient once or sometimes twice a week. The most effective facilitators are going to be folks that are with the communicator consistently throughout the day. And so this adds kind of another layer of communication and collaboration where the person who might be leading the team isn't present in the daily environments and may not be accessible on a day-to-day basis. Not necessarily a problem, just an important consideration that we have to make when we think about how we would communicate and collaborate going forward. Communication partners for this individual might be peers, less familiar adults, medical providers, and community members, just like in any other scenario. The last scenario that I was thinking about sharing with you is typically I find this scenario with adult communicators. So usually the AAC finder is a physician. So in this scenario, it's a neurologist who then directly refers the patient to an outpatient SLP, to an outpatient clinic for an AAC evaluation. And in this scenario, sometimes that outpatient SLP never transfers the reins of intervention specialist. Sometimes that outpatient SLP stays the driver of the intervention because there may not be another qualified member of the team to do so. AAC daily facilitators here could include the group home manager, the day program consultant, therapist, family members, anyone who's consistently present for this communicator. And communication partners could, again, include peers, medical providers, potentially coworkers, potentially transit staff, if this is an individual that's taking transit to get where they need to go. And so you can see how in these different scenarios, how having different roles in different environments can change the way that we have to consider how we collaborate and communicate. So I have some tips for how to facilitate communication no matter how your team is configured. The first thing that I suggest is keeping team members in the loop across environments. So often it can be helpful for the family to be the point of contact for this, because they're with that communicator or the family or caregivers. They're with that individual most of the time. So families, if you're planning to come out to outpatient for an AAC evaluation, let your school team know that you're planning to do that. And school providers, you can help. If you know a student is coming out to us, we can work in advance to have information releases signed in anticipation of needed communication between different providers. We always want to know what you've tried and what has worked and what you're hoping to find out. The most important thing to think about here is that we want to avoid everybody who exists in different environments. So those of us who exist out in outpatient, those of us who exist out in schools, and those of us who exist kind of at home and in the community, we want to avoid getting really siloed and having everybody doing different things, because that doesn't always drive progress forward when it comes to AAC. So one way we could do that is to meet at defined intervals. This is if your process is happening really without outpatient involvement, you're only working through your school, there are some formal meetings that you'll have in order to review AAC evaluation results, hear about what the district's going to provide for equipment. So there will be some IEP meetings or reconvene meetings that will happen at defined intervals. Now, if you do have outpatient involvement, that provider might not be available to go to those meetings. And so then it's important to meet, you'll have your defined meeting with that provider at the appointment. So you have your meeting there, and then your meeting at school, and then there should be some communication between outpatient and school, which doesn't necessarily have to go through family. If you prefer to sign information releases, folks can communicate with each other independently. And then may just need a check in, make sure that actually happened. But I will admit that meeting as an entire team is one of the most challenging things to try and do when you have many team members across environments. And so it doesn't have to be one huge meeting. It can be multiple smaller meetings with good communication about what went on in each one. I already talked about signing releases to allow team members of different environments to communicate with one another. This is something that can be really valuable. I can speak to it as an outpatient provider. I have limited time and unpredictable time to make my calls and connect with folks. So if you're comfortable signing releases to allow someone like me to communicate with someone like your school-based provider, that can be an efficient way to make sure that everyone's in the loop. This next point about asking for specialist support, this is particularly important for folks who don't have a lot of prior understanding or exposure or knowledge or interest in AAC until they're within this process. So just know that even if you feel under-equipped, as a family member, as an AAC user yourself, as a school-based provider, as an outpatient provider, there are specialists who can support you in some capacity or other. If you're on a school team, your district likely has an in-house consultant or a contracted consultant that can actually be added to the IEP in the consult minutes of that's the A grid, I believe, of the IEP. And so you can ask your school to add those minutes and to bring in that contractor to make sure that your team is fully supported. If you're a parent or a family member and you're not sure of the best way to move forward, come into your outpatient therapy sessions and sit in and watch what's going on and ask your questions. And we're here to help you troubleshoot what's going on at home. That's one of the amazing things about having outpatient involved in your AAC team, is that we have more direct line of communication with families, because you can physically come into our office and sit in and look at that device in a session with us, where you may not always be able to do that at school. If you're an outpatient provider and you're feeling like you need more support, email me and we can have a phone conversation about how you can be best supported. That being said, this process does really require folks to get excited and interested and invested in the knowledge that they learn, to kind of drive the process forward and keep everyone engaged and keep moving toward the goals that we set together. So once you learn something, share what you learn so that everybody on your team can benefit from your knowledge too, and everybody can move forward with the same foundation of information. This next one about sharing successes, I do find that a lot of times we call meetings because we're having problems. And it's really, really important. I insist, whenever, even if the meeting's been called to address a problem, we must talk first about what's gone well. Because certainly, I guarantee you, even though you might be encountering a problem, it's not the same problem that we were encountering on day one. And so I encourage you to share successes in addition to the problems that you see, so that we can stay grounded in the fact that we are moving forward, that we are making progress, and that even though problems still exist, we've come a long way. Even if it's only from day 1 to day 2, it's still a long way. So I suggest that when we identify problems, we will bring evidence and then solicit feedback and suggest solutions. So if there is a problem that you can identify, tell the team how you're seeing that problem manifesting in your communicator's life and in the environment that you're the most present in. And then ask other team members from other environments whether they're encountering a similar problem or how that problem is maybe not presenting in that environment. And then suggest and also solicit solutions, because that's the whole point of this team. The team is to support one another, create a coordinated approach forward, and to benefit from the perspectives and expertise of everybody in the room and at the table. And then when we do make a plan to address a problem, I suggest that we make a plan on how we will implement those strategies. So some teams are successful without writing anything down. They just know what they've agreed on, and they kind of carry on forward. But it can be particularly helpful to have written plans and to take data on how things are going if we're finding that the approach is becoming uncoordinated or we're not sure if it's really being effective. Okay. Collaboration and problem solving are 2 really important topics when we think about these teams. So what we can do in order to foster collaboration and set the stage for problem solving is, first of all, to set goals together. So meet as a team, set goals together. I find that this works really well so for example, if I can get the school SLP on the phone during my session with my patient, I can say, here's how I'm seeing things happening here in outpatient. How are you seeing similar things out at school, and family, are you seeing similar things out at home? And if so, what do we think about this goal that would address all of these needs across these settings? And then we can agree together on what those goals are and how we might achieve them. We can move forward with a coordinated effort. So we know if our goal is to have modeling taking place at least once an hour on the AAC system, we know that everybody in every environment is going to attempt to model on an AAC system at least once an hour. And so maybe we have a tracking sheet or a data sheet if that's needed, so that we can make sure that we're all moving forward with a similar approach. We can communicate regularly, and we can, especially about successes and problems, and we can make joint decisions about what to do with them. Common problems I see on AAC teams are communication barriers. So maybe it's the summertime and the school SLP isn't working and they cannot be reached. That would be a communication barrier. There sometimes is a lack of coordinated approach, and that's not necessarily due to anyone's misgivings. This can just be because everybody's interpreted what the plan is slightly differently. And so it's important to be clear about what the plan will be. Unstructured communication can sometimes become a challenge, wherein you're having regular meetings, you're having regular communication, but you don't seem to be getting anywhere. And what we can do about that is agree on a meeting structure or use templates for communication in order to keep our meetings organized. And that's what this template here on the slide is. It's a team meeting template with a proposed agenda where you first start by sharing stories and celebrating successes. You then get a progress update from each team member. We talk about what's working. We talk about barriers or difficulties. We talk about improvements that are needed. We talk about upcoming events or changes that we need to address, and so on and so forth. So that can be a form like this could be really helpful to keep communication structured and keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak. Another common problem can be unclear roles and responsibilities. So that could mean that someone is not understanding or maybe not aware of what their role is. And so if they're not aware of what their role is, they're not aware of what their responsibilities might be, they may not be fulfilling them. And so one thing that we can do to address that is to make sure that we do set clear roles and responsibilities, and that everyone on the team is honest about what responsibilities they're capable of taking on and how those capabilities may change. So, and if you're a family member, that could mean, coming to your team and saying, I know we talked about modeling once an hour, but I'm getting really overwhelmed by that because of what I've got going on at home. So I'm not able to fulfill that responsibility. So let's go back to the drawing board and think about how we can still be successfully implementing AAC at home in a way that is more possible for our family structure and our life. Other things we can do to address some of these problems are, I think we talked about them all actually. So, the last one is to check in on progress toward these mutual goals. So maybe adding a meeting agenda item to say, I think there was one on this agenda, to say, how are we doing? What were our goals initially? And how are we getting on towards them? And are we getting on towards them? All right. In summary, strong, coordinated AAC teams are critical to the success of the AAC user. Defining and redefining the roles and responsibilities of team members over time will help the team move forward. Strong teams typically will have common goals, a coordinated approach to meet them, and a way to measure progress towards them. And they'll have clearly defined and redefined over time roles and responsibilities, and a plan to address conflict if that is needed. I'd like to thank you for your attention tonight, and open the floor to any questions that you might have.
We do have some questions in the chat.
Oh, thank you. I will take a look.
Like, is there a youngest age that would be considered for AAC devices or an evaluation?
That's a great question. There is not technically a youngest age There are tools and supports that are appropriate for folks at every age that may support them to communicate or learn skills that are related to communication. I would suggest in those early years, especially under 3, to be talking to early intervention providers about what might be useful or helpful to implement at that time. I do sometimes see 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds in outpatient, and we do sometimes get them AAC devices depending on what their needs and skills are. With this age group, the biggest challenge is that usually by the end of that insurance funding trial, we have to show that the patient has made significant progress towards being independent with an AAC device or is independent with that device. And that is just not always feasible for every 2 and 3 and 4-year-old. But not to worry, then we can explore lots of other options. What I suggest is if you're in doubt, come on in for an evaluation, and we can see what we come to for you. Let's see. I have a question here about whether we'll cover specific devices and supports for AAC. Specific devices and specific supports are outside the scope of today's presentation, but I'm happy to have a conversation with you at the end of tonight's presentation and give you some resources for how you can get the information you're looking for. Okay, if a non-speaking child is recommended word power 20, that's an AAC vocabulary, by an AAC specialist in an outpatient clinic, but the school wants to stick to using word power 42, even though the child is not progressing. How can we resolve this situation? And it sounds like this is a new system for this child who previously used something. While I can't offer any real clinical advice without having met your child, I do see that there are some communication barriers here in terms of coordinating with your team. I would suggest bringing all of what we have here is 2 separate AAC intervention specialists that are maybe not communicating with each other at this time. And now we can have two specialists in that arena, but I suggest, I know it can be difficult to get everybody in the same room, but I do think that in this particular scenario, it would be valuable to have the school team in the same space as the outpatient specialist to discuss the kinds of challenges and the progress that you're hoping for in order to determine what the coordinated approach might be forward.